He rented his house as a long-term rental. And then one day, the thought of renting it or listed it on Airbnb came to his mind. So out of curiosity, he went on the Airbnb website and he searched for Airbnb in his area. And to his surprise, his house was listed on Airbnb. With no knowledge, he didn't know nothing of his house being an Airbnb. He took up the phone and he found his tenant. In this video, I will be sharing a story about a friend of a very good friend that I have who is living in the US. He has a two-bedroom house in Caribbean Estate, Jamaica, that he was doing a long-term rental with. He had a tenant. He rented the house to the tenant. And then one day, he saw it listed as an Airbnb. Also, we will be looking at the law that governs the landlord and the tenant in Jamaica. Good day, my name is Rochelle. I am a Jamaican girl living in Canada. On this channel, I speak about life in Canada as well as in Jamaica. My contents are mainly about real estate and doing businesses in Jamaica. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment down below. A particular person, he has a two-bedroom house in Caribbean Estate, Portmore, Jamaica, and he rented it as a long-term rental. One day, out of curiosity, he was looking on the internet about Airbnb in his area because the thought of listing it as an Airbnb come to mind. And to his surprise, he saw his house listed as an Airbnb. Now he was so furious. He spoke with the tenant, and of course he denied it. But with further, conversation and so forth, he admitted and he told the landlord that he's not coming out of the house. Now, what the landlord had to do was to get a lawyer because, of course, he was in the US, or he's living in the US, and he wasn't in Jamaica at that time. It was a long process based on what I've heard because the utilities wasn't in the tenant name. He went ahead and got them disconnected. So both light and water was disconnected. So you know that once the utilities are disconnected, he can never continue with the Airbnb. Also, he got a lawyer. It was a long process, not really a very long process, but the back and forth, the back and forth. And of course, he couldn't be bothered with this. But to cut a long story short, eventually he had to leave the premises. I am really at a crossroad right now because I do have an apartment at my house that I was initially I was planning on renting it as a long-term rental, maybe a year. So I'll just give a year contract to my tenant. However, I'd rather list it as an Airbnb because I don't want the issue of, having problem with a tenant and so forth. So, and the whole other issue that it comes with. But then again, being in Canada and having a house in Jamaica as listed as an Airbnb, there can also be issues because you'd have to have somebody that is very reliable to take care of business for you. For instance, being the host and having the apartment cleaned and just general maintenance and upkeep of the apartment and ensuring that your business is running right. So what do I do? Do I just employ someone to do that and list it as an Airbnb, or just do a long-term rental, which is easier? They just need to sign a lease and then the rent would be deposited in my account on a monthly basis. But then again, as I said before, there are a fair share of problems that come with that. Now, listen to this story about the gentleman who rented his house as a long-term rental and then the guy in turn used it as an Airbnb. I know that there are people who have done that. They have rented apartments or they have rented houses and then they listed it as Airbnb. So I don't know how to feel about that because that is something that I would do. However, I would also ensure that the landlord know of it and is okay with me doing that. And I think that is where the tenant went wrong because he did not inform the landlord about this. So the landlord finding this out on his own, no, of course, I would be mad. And just to know that, I believe the person told me that he was paying at that time, because it's been a while, about $60,000 per month for the rent, and he was making so much more on the house. This was known because of what the landlord saw on Airbnb, the rate it was going for, as well as the bookings. It was like well booked out. So I do understand. In that case, it depends. I would probably just raise the rent and have him operating it still as an Airbnb. But then again, I wouldn't be able to trust him because if he would have let the landlord know beforehand that this is his intended plan for the house, maybe, who to know, the landlord would probably agree and say, you know what, pay me this amount and whatever you make and it is yours. Because of course you'd be having a host, someone who is taking care of the property, ensuring that it's clean, it's maintained, and you're just basically making some passive income there. Well, not sure, because of course it's your asset, but it all depends on how one view it. But again, I strongly believe that honesty is the best policy. Should have communicated this to the landlord, and then the landlord would have decided that, you know what, no, I don't want this, or he would operate it on his own terms. But him being overseas now could have maybe he would have agreed because he's not there to manage the whole Airbnb thing. So if he had a second person, that would be good. It all depends on how one might look at it. One thing for sure, I know that there are laws in Jamaica that govern the rental of property for both landlord and tenant. But sometimes it may seem that the tenant may get the upper hand over the landlord at times. For instance, if you give someone notice from your property, the person would have some grace period to leave. And if they do not find another house or wherever to live, they can, you take them to court, you can let the judge know that, hey, I'm actively searching and I haven't found somewhere. And they can give you additional time to stay. Also, you can owe the landlord months of rent and you are still living in the property. And I believe that once the landlord give you notice, you have the right to not pay rent. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I have some information that I'm going to plug into this video as it pertains to the law that govern the tenant and the landlord. So just stick around with me, watch the end, and thank you so much for tuning in. A tenant cannot operate a business from a rented house as it violates the lease unless the landlord grants written permission. Proceeding without consent is a violation of the lease and poses severe legal and financial risk. So the tenant was definitely at fault here. So even if the landlord were to give permission, short-term rentals in Jamaica are highly regulated. Operating without following government regulations can lead to fines for both the property owner and the tenant. If the landlord discovers that a tenant is hosting short-term rental without authorization, they can initiate eviction proceedings for breach of contract. Section 27 of the Rent Restriction Act. It stated that you cannot evict a tenant without obtaining a court order. Self-help evictions, such as changing the lock or forcibly removing belongings, are entirely illegal and can result in severe penalties for the landlord. So definitely the landlord has to go through the court system, and the tenant knows that. And that is why he said that he's not coming out of the house. So what are the steps the landlord need to take now? So first thing first, the landlord will have to serve a notice to quit. The landlord must provide the tenant with a formal written notice to quit. It must explicitly state the reason for eviction and the exact date by which the tenant must leave. Notice periods can vary based on the specific grounds, usually 30 days for rent arrears. Apply to the court if the tenant does not vacate by the expiration of the notice. The landlord cannot remove them. The landlord cannot remove them. You hear that? The landlord must apply to the local resident magistrate court, and that is the parish court, for an order of ejectment. Court hearing and bailiff. So, court hearing and bailiff. Both the landlord and the tenant will have a chance to present their cases. If, and that is if the court rules in favor of the landlord, a certified court bailiff must execute the eviction order, not the landlord, but the bailiff. So when the landlord go and change the lock or cut off the water, whatever, he's in the wrong. And that is why some of these landlord act on by themselves, because all this rigmarole to get someone out of your place, it is a lot. Trust me. So on the question of long-term rental, short-term rental, in nutshell, Airbnb, I think maybe it's better to do an Airbnb than to do a long-term rental. Sometimes it work out for the long-term rental, only if you get a very good tenant. There you go, my people. Thank you so very much for tuning in once more. I hope you have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, a wonderful month, a wonderful year. Thank you again. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below. Bless. Thank you. Mwah.